All right, thanks for having me. Welcome everyone to North Platte, by the way. As you can see, we have quite the active weather we've alluded to. It's been kind of a doozy of a spring here. I'll break down some numbers that kind of go into the fire weather aspects. I'll be covering what happened the last year or so, and then Sean will take over. I'll toss it to him where we go from now and look at the fall outlook and beyond. So some of the highlights, what we've already covered. Basically, the conditions that leading to our active fire weather season this past year. Basically, Nebraska's been in a drought, and a pretty serious one. One or another type is the very warm temperatures, especially last fall, and then we've had some record-breaking temperatures in the spring, and then we had quite the wind this spring. I know Nebraska is typically pretty windy, but this year was kind of took the top of that. Whew. Some fires that we'll also cover, some local and regional fires. We'll break down into basically what the weather conditions were leading into those. So looking at how weather impacts fire and fire behavior, basically one of the sides, but we also break down the weather component into three main things. Basically, got to have the temperatures or the heat component. Another one's the humidity or moisture. And what we seem to have quite a bit of here in Nebraska and the rest of the plains is the wind. But take a look at the drought, especially this past couple years. At least most of the state has been in some type of drought. And this plot shows the percentage of the state area that's covered in the certain types of drought. The yellow being kind of the abnormally dry, the precursor to the actual drought index. The tan is being the first category of drought, orange being the second, red being the third. We do have a fourth category that hasn't been experienced up until about a week or two ago. We just started getting that introduced into southwest Nebraska. But really, this current drought has been going on for the last couple years. It really started at the end of 2020 into the first part of 2021. And really, this comes on the heels of 2 years of normal or even wet conditions. Just back in 2019, we had the fourth wettest summer in North Platte, and we followed that up with quite a bit of drought and dry weather. And we take a wider view over the past several years. Really, this is our worst drought since the big one in 2012 and 2013. We're not at the coverage yet or the intensity yet, but really, we follow up this huge span of somewhat normal conditions with the next drought. Really about 10 years in the making. Take a look at the rainfall amounts or the general precip. I started this back at the end of last summer or the beginning of last summer. It goes through this past spring. What we should be expecting here in southwest Nebraska, I just used North Platte as the proxy. But we never really held a normal rainfall or snowfall amount here. We've always been running the deficit. Now, we had a couple big storms in there with a couple events that led to 2, 3, or even close to 4 inches of rain over the span of a couple days, but still it was not enough to make up our deficit. And the current running total for from last summer to this spring was about 4 inches in North Platte. And then the current total for the year to date, we're about 5 inches below where we should be. And that's quite a bit for our area. And it gets even worse off to our west and southwest and toward the Colorado and Kansas borders. They've received even less rain than we have in North Platte. So that's the rainfall amount. If we look at just the snow, which can have a pretty beneficial impact for winter precipitation, you get that snow melt heading into the main season in the spring, we have a deficit there as well. We had a couple events. For North Platte, we had our typical Halloween snowstorm, or at least a few inches there. That's always fun, taking a 4-year-old out, trying to trick-or-treat in that. And then Valentine had about a foot of snow in the first part of December, and then past that, we really haven't had much in western Nebraska. And the big deficits came really about in January and February. I don't know how many winters I can count for my 10 years I've been here that we've had essentially no snow in January or February here. And then, of course, we get some in March and then a little bit in May. But overall, we ended up about 6 inches short in North Platte. and about 15 inches short in Valentine. Well, how much of this climate stuff can be really tied to El Nino or La Nina and the other climate oscillations? We've been in La Nina for the last couple years, which is kind of a messy plot with the black line showing El Nino or La Nina, and the red and the blue showing whether we're warmer or wetter or drier compared to normal. It's really tough to pick out any concrete, key point takeaway here, whether if we're El Nino, it's going to be wet or dry or vice versa. But one thing we have noticed from our office, kind of observation-wise, whenever we are in the La Nina, we typically have a somewhat warmer and drier winter. Winter is really where the climate stuff stands out for our area. Not saying that's always happens, but especially the last couple years we've noticed that, where we've been warmer and drier somewhat in the southwest part of the state. And what we've noticed in the northern part, they get a lot of wind and kind of weak, quick-moving storm systems with drop about an inch or two of snow at a time. Instead of those major snow events that really help build up the moisture, it's just these really quick frontal passages that really produce flurries or an inch. And as you saw in the previous plot, really doesn't do much for the snow totals. But we'll flip it over to temperatures, and it's really about the same thing as the precipitation. Whether it's El Nino or La Nina throughout the year, it's really tough to get a good picture about which results in which. In El Nino, La Nina, that's really the oscillation that grabs most of the attention from media or research, but there are a few other oscillations that can have an impact on the weather. But for this part, we'll focus mainly on El Nino, La Nina. And really, I guess the main takeaway here, generally it's been a lot warmer than it's been cooler, no matter what part of the oscillation we have the last few years, and especially the last couple. And I'll break that down into the last year or so. Again, I'm using June to May to really cover the fall season last year and preceding the main fire weather season we had this spring. I know this is a pretty messy plot, but what I wanted to show, the little brown area is where we should be, kind of the daily normal temperatures for that particular day. The red area is above normal, blue is below, with the thicker lines being kind of the daily maxes and mins, or the daily records set. With all the dark blue lines, that's our observed high and low. And what stands out to me is the first half of the plot, essentially last summer going into the first part of winter. A lot of those daily highs and lows are falling on the top end of the graph. So there's a lot of more warmer conditions compared to cooler going into the winter season. Then we kind of evened out in the spring. We had some cool spells, including a low of minus 20 at North Platte on New Year's Day. That's always fun when you lose power at the house. Then we had some warm spells after that, including the 97-degree day at the end of April. That's that one little bar that sticks up toward the end of the plot. And I'll cover more about that day a little later in the talk. But I'm a numbers guy, so I had to throw in a little chart here to help kind of get a better, clearer picture about what the temperatures actually did on the long haul. Basically, from September to December, we'll focus just on those 4 months across our forecast area. North Platte ended up having the second warmest stretch in its history back to 1875. Valentine had their first warmest. So this past fall really stood out in terms of temperatures. And these averages over the entire month, 2 to 4 degrees over the long run, that's a pretty solid warm there. And once we especially get into the 5 or 6 or 7 degrees warmer than where we should be for that month, I mean, that can make a big difference. Now, these are the monthly averages. I mean, 7 degrees can make a pretty big impact even on the daily time scale, and especially in this time of year. If you're talking 28 degrees compared to 35 in the middle of December, that can mean a difference between a foot of snow and an inch of rain. So just kind of put that in perspective, these are pretty big anomalies that we had last year. And if we chop off just November, December, both towns had their warmest stretch on record. And then doing some number crunching, Valentine's second warmest stretch in November, December actually came the year before. So they had back-to-back record-setting last parts of the year. So this is what we're dealing with, kind of compound the warmth and the drought going into this active fire season here. Then again, it kind of evened out going into the spring, where we had more reasonable values for our monthly temperatures. Of course, the first part of the winter warmth continued for Valentine, and then we had a little cool spell in the middle of spring for North Platte. That's when we had a lot of our snow, was during the month of March. But pretty reasonable values, nothing out of the ordinary for us to be a degree or two above or below normal. But again, that was also taken into account the days where we were hitting 80 in March, 97 in April. And that one day where we hit 97, that was our second warmest April day on record at North Platte, only followed by a 98-degree reading at the end of the month about 10 years ago. And of course, the wind. I still can't get over that, especially coming from Ohio. I thought 10 miles an hour was kind of breezy, standing outside, trying to play outside. And this year kind of really set it apart. This was some data that we got from the surface observations going back to about 1948. It turned out that this past April was the third windiest on average over the past, 70 years or so. Our office, we issued 5 high wind warnings during the month of April. That's the most that we've issued in a single month going back for recent history. A little bit behind the high wind warning, our criteria for that is generally 60-mile-an-hour wind gusts, and that is outside any thunderstorms. So we could be having clear blue skies, and the wind is blowing 60 miles an hour. And these events, they don't really last about 10 or 15 minutes like what we do have in a thunderstorm. These are hours or days-long events. So we had 12 days out of the month of April where we had a gust of at least 50 miles an hour, 5 days of the 60-plus, and we had 2 days where we had wind gusts exceeding 70 miles an hour at North Platte. And then you see the little bar graph. The green bar is 2022. We went a pretty good stretch of near normal or even kind of less windy years, and then this one came along, and it's actually the windiest since, the one that got closest was 1984. So it's been quite some time where we've had that much wind in the spring. The wind kept up during May. We issued 3 more high wind warnings in that month, including one for 70-mile-an-hour winds. And then you put all those things together, the heat, the drought, we had quite a bit of dust. Now, I wasn't alive during the Dust Bowl, but I can only imagine what that may have been like. This was the view from my backyard. I was actually on night shifts during this event, and I woke up to that looking out my back window. I'm like, what is that? Only to realize it was a wall of dust coming straight for me. So we issued our first ever blowing dust advisory for our forecast office back in April. We ended up issuing 2 more during that month. And then as the wind and the drought continued into May, we ended up issuing 3 dust storm warnings. And the warnings we issue, when basically the visibility goes down to 0. And the warnings are the ones that alert your phones, letting you know that you basically expect huge visibility reductions, and if you're traveling down the interstate at 70 or 80 miles an hour and you come across the wall of dust with 0 visibility, it can have huge impacts. So basically what caused this wind? Kind of taking a real step back, essentially wind comes from the huge changes in atmospheric pressure or temperature, and we had both of those this past spring. The causes of those are generally stronger storm systems where they feed off the pressure, temperature changes, what the jet stream is doing, whether it's stronger than normal or the placement over the region. And spring is typically our windiest season here in Nebraska and the surrounding states. On our left side of the plot, we show where April is. April typically is our windiest month, but again, this year kind of really stood out. On the right is some data that we got from our weather balloons that we launched twice a day at our office. This is the wind speed it was measuring at about 500 millibars up, or roughly translates to 18,000 feet up in the sky. And of course, going back the last 50 to 60 years, our balloons measured basically the windiest it's been in that time frame at about 18,000 feet up. That's part of where the jet stream lies, there and then above it. So whether it was a stronger than normal jet stream or the jet stream just happened to line up right over Nebraska this year is yet to be seen. But either way, we definitely felt the impacts of that. So again, putting all this together, the heat and the dry and the wind kind of factor into when we issue red flag warnings. So here's the climatology of what we've issued for red flag warnings going back through 2006. And April 2022 definitely stands out. We ended up issuing 15 of those for our forecast area, which generally covers the Sandhills in southwest Nebraska, about 26 counties in our state. It falls under our responsibility. The 15 of those warnings is the most for any single month going back through 2006. And if we open it up to the entire spring shoulder season of March to May, we issued 22, which beats the pretty active season of 2012. Now, fortunately, we have not had the red flag status of during the summer that we had in 2012, but the spring definitely set apart. And we are running about a 10-month streak of having a red flag warning in our forecast area at any given time. Given the one that we had in August was due to dry lightning. We're expecting some isolated thunderstorm coverage with a lot of lightning with very little precipitation, but the vast majority of those are driven by the hot, dry, windy weather. So what kind of leads to our red flag weather? Basically two big patterns that we look for. The top one being the ridge breakdown. And essentially the upper level ridge is a strong high pressure system at about that 18,000 foot level that I showed the wind plot for earlier. We have a big high pressure there that pushes the jet stream well to our north. And depending on the season, whether it's spring or summer or fall, we can have anywhere from seasonably warm temperatures to the triple-digit heat that we really bake under. And under that ridge is generally pretty dry. Now, we could have some of those summertime pop-up storms that your neighbor may get an inch and then you're still left bone dry. But all in all, it's pretty sunny and warm and dry under the upper-level ridge. And then once that starts to break down, basically it gets kicked out by a low-pressure system in the upper-level trough. A few things happen. One, the winds increase, especially out of the south, southeast, or southwest. So we're getting that wind component, and especially a little more warmth. Usually when the ridge breaks down, we have about one more day of increasing warm temperatures out ahead of a cool front. Two, the winds a few thousand feet up tend to come out of the west. And when they come off the Rockies into our area, they add even a more warmer and drier component to the conditions. And then we get the cool front coming through. And with the cool front, we have a couple things. One, we got to be looking for thunderstorms. So if we're dealing with severe weather potential or just general thunderstorm potential, that adds even more of the wind component, whether it's gusty winds or the erratic type that can be pretty hazardous to the fire crews fighting, or with, again, severe potential. And then, once the front does come through, a big wind shift. So if you have a fire start out on the warm, typically dry part of the system, and it's screaming northward, and then you get that front to come back, it's going to completely change directions. A whole new fighting tactic. And then the other is dry lightning, which typically we don't get a lot of in Nebraska, but we've had kind of more of our fair share of it this past spring, with being compounded by the drought status. In order for thunderstorms to develop, we got to have the moisture, but it's all where that moisture comes into play. We don't have it down here at the surface. It's coming up from 5, 10, or 15,000 feet up. Basically, you got to have enough to even make the thunderstorm, and you got to have the instability to basically help the thunderstorms keep growing. Because once they get tall enough, that's where the lightning comes into play. So even with that thunderstorm overhead or nearby, not all that rain reaches the surface. So it could be falling underneath it or out on the verge of the thunderstorm, but basically little moisture reaches the ground. What still does reach are the lightning bolts and the gusty winds. You can't escape that. So that was what we were dealing with for a few of the events this past year. Was some of these events were on the outskirts of the heavier rain events. So here I'll be covering a few of our higher profile fires in our region and really take a look at the weather behind it, or what conditions were leading up to it. Not necessarily the cause of these fires, because I know I don't know the definite cause for quite a handful of them, but I'll just go into what weather conditions were preceding the events. We'll start off with the Votal road fire. This one was in mid-March and actually occurred just about 20 miles south of here near Wellfleet. This was a relatively compact fire. Only about 900 acres were burned, but where it did fall in was the Les Canyon region. So you're dealing with pretty steep terrain, lots of cliffs, lots of canyons, and again, what's been kind of a theme here is a lot of the cedar trees. This relatively small fire elicited response from 25 different area fire departments, as well as state resources from NEMA. With the weather conditions going into this, we woke up that morning and it was 21 degrees and we had fog outside. Not really what you'd expect on a red flag warning day, or one that you get kind of a fire that elicits that response. But that's the power of the warm front and the strong solar cycle or strong solar heating. And once you're getting into that mid-March and the mid-spring, we warmed up to 72 degrees that day, about 17 degrees higher than where we should be for mid-March. We ended up getting winds about 30, 35 miles an hour, and that dropped our humidity down to 13%. So we ended up verifying the red flag warning, even waking up with a sub-freezing low and fog. Preceding that event, going back in the previous week, again, that's when North Platte had two of its bigger snow events of the year. We got a half inch of moisture, all in the form of snow, back on March 5th, and then we got a little bit more just a few days before. So pictures from my back and front yard here. One about a week out with several inches of snow on the ground. And then the day of, I got the smoke plume, actually not realizing that was the cause of it that day, only to find out the next time I was in at work that, this is a serious fire. We had highs in the 50s and 60s for about the 3 days preceding this. So basically accelerating the snow melt, and that, along with the warm temperatures and the wind, helped prime the conditions. About 3 weeks later, we had a much larger fire, just about a county over. This was the Road 739 fire that ended up burning about 35,000 acres. Another windy day, not actually warm. This one was a little cooler than where we should be, but a lot windier. We did have the red flag warning out in that area. The humidity really didn't make it, but the wind more than made up for it. And this was on the backside of one of those strong April storm systems. The surface map for this day in the afternoon, it actually shows the center of the storm over in Wisconsin. It was that far away, but Nebraska had 60 to 70 mile an hour winds on the backside of that, all out of the north. We only had about a trace of moisture in the week leading up to this event, but we did have 2 or 3 days of 50 to 60 mile an hour wind gusts. And the Sentinel satellite imagery shows kind of the scope of this fire from beforehand and then after with the burn scar. And when that fire was making a run straight for Arapahoe, and then luckily moved just to the east. Again, April 22nd, this was the day that we hit 97 degrees. This was Well, arguably the most active fire weather day of the season. We had several across the region in the state. We had a 5,000-acre one to our west and south, or in our far southwest Nebraska, a 30,000-acre one up in the heart of the Sandhills. There was one out towards Scotts Bluff, coinciding with 80-mile-an-hour wind gusts. So the winds alone led to property damage. Some more fires out toward the Sidney, Nebraska area. And then eastern Nebraska was also not immune to this system. They had a couple out toward Burt County and Rising City. The one that I'll really be focusing on in this little part of the talk is Road 702 fire. And this is the map from the PIO from that response. In the top right corner, that was the 739 road fire that we just had 2 weeks before. And then 702 is just a few miles away. This one actually started in northern Kansas and sped north into Nebraska, ultimately covering about 44,000 acres, and elicited help from the Rocky Mountain Complex team. So along with the typical hazards we see with fire weather, or the around or near fires with smoke and the actual fire itself, we had the added component of blowing dust with this one. So we had a lot of factors reducing visibility, making this an especially difficult and pretty dangerous system to be out battling. The weather system going into this fire, and this day in particular, this is about as classic of a ridge breakdown pattern as we get, maybe even more amplified and out there even compared to normal. We have on the top right map, that's sort of map about 18,000 feet up, so the kind of that 500 millibar level where we had record winds throughout the month. We have our big ridge of high pressure to our east that was giving way to a real strong low pressure to the west. Bless you. We have winds at about 90 mile an hour. Our weather balloon measured 90 mile an hour winds at that level, about 18,000 feet up that morning. And at the surface, we had a pretty strong warm front, helping pull temperatures in the 90s, followed by the dry line during the afternoon, which sank humidity down to 10%. And with that whole system, with the severity of it, the upper level part and near the surface with the low pressure and all these fronts, we had winds gusting 60 to 70 mile an hour that day. So this setup with 90 highs in the 90s, winds about 70 mile an hour, humidity at 10%, this is stuff that Southern California sees in their extreme fire events, battling Santa Ana winds and whatnot. This is kind of a real anomaly for Nebraska in April, nonetheless. So going into this system, we had basically 3 days of pretty warm conditions. This was the tail end of it, right as the ridge was breaking down. And again, this is on the 22nd of the month. The month-to-date precip at North Platte was a trace, basically not enough to measure. So we had essentially 3 weeks of no precip going into this event. And we already had 7 days of at least 50 mile an hour winds, hence the dust hazard to go with the system. And it didn't quit after the fire start. We had another 70 mile an hour gust the very next day, and then we followed up with more 50 plus the day after that. And of course, we warmed right back into the 80s after a brief cool down. Kind of the radar screenshots I grabbed from that evening with a few of the fires that occurred. You see Scotts Bluff and the Elsie fires on the west side behind the dry line, where we're battling basically the really strong winds, and behind the dry line where we never saw a drop of rain, and to the east where we had the isolated thunderstorm coverage. There was severe weather in the Dakotas and severe weather in Kansas, and we had the heat and the wind with a few thunderstorms. And then the combination of the blowing dust and the wildfire smoke led to pretty eerie sunsets in the area. Kind of that real tan, hazy hue to it. We had the fire up in the Nebraska National Forest near Halsey. That was in May. That ended up burning about 4,200 acres. Now going into this fire, almost typical what you see in May. We're getting the warmer temperatures, not a crazy wind like we did in April, but we did have thunderstorms in the area during the evening. And I took the observations from Valentine. They've actually had a few rounds of wetting rain in May going into this thing. And I don't know if you can pick out on the picture, but there's actually some green tint. So a lot of the grasses were relatively green, or at least a patchwork of green in there, but the timber had the lasting effects from the drought and the sustained dry weather. We had a severe thunderstorm just to the north of the forest. So the weather pattern, again, it's kind of typical what we see in May, with the front off to our north, kind of bringing cool weather the next day or so. But we had the storm kind of right on the verge of the forest. And then the last one I'll cover for this year is the Carter Canyon fire. This was out in the Panhandle near Scottsbluff and Gearing. Ended up burning about 15,000 acres, 13 of which occurred in the first 6 hours of the event. Again, at the end of July, really nothing out of the ordinary for far western Nebraska. Highs in the 90s. Wind, really not that impressive. Humidity, not really reaching critical criteria. But again, we did have some thunderstorms in the area that evening. And really, Scottsbluff for the entire month of July, their last previous significant rainfall, or significant kind of in air quotes there with being 1/10 of an inch, was about 3.5 weeks before. So they really had kind of an extended dry period there as well. And they were about 3 degrees above normal temperature-wise for the month. So again, sustained warm and dry weather in the Panhandle going into this past summer. Again, a little radar screenshot that evening with the storms just off to the north and the south. And then from here, I'll hand it over to Sean to show where we're going into this coming fall and beyond.